Good evening and welcome to Primetime Lawmakers for March 14, 2011, the 29th legislative day of the 2011 session of the Georgia General Assembly. As you see it live, the Senate continues to be in session at this hour. I'm Scott Slade. Coming up on tonight's program, a bill requiring state contractors and private employers to register with a federally verified program to determine the legal status of workers passes the Senate. The House passes a zero-based budgeting measure. That bill will require 1/4 of the state budget to be created from scratch each year. I'll catch up with Tom Crawford of the Georgia Report on the latest issues before the General Assembly. And Friday saw the passage of the $18.1 billion FY 2012 budget in the House. I'll be joined tonight by the chairman of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, Representative Terry England and Senator Jack Hill, as we look to see what happens next. All that and more is coming up on Primetime Lawmakers. But first, the Senate passes its version of immigration reform. And Wandy Lawson joins us live from the Capitol with the latest in Senate Bill 40. Good evening, Wandy.
Good evening, Scott. As you just mentioned, the Senate's still in session, although wrapping up its business at this time after a full day of debate, including 2.5 hours of floor debate on SB 40. Proponents of that measure say that the state must step in where the federal government has failed to keep undocumented workers off state and private payrolls and from receiving public services. An effort was made to amend the bill so that companies with only more than 25 workers would be required to verify employee immigration status. Senate President Pro Tem Tommy Williams said he supports the measure, but he thinks parts of it harm small business.
Some of this bill I'm actually for, and I'll vote for the bill. And I do e-verify in my company. But I will tell you this, you're fixing to give small businesses, I hope you'll vote for the amendment, at least you'll eliminate some of those who are just getting started, the burden of one more thing we're asking them to do. If we're really about creating jobs, adding on another requirement is a poor way to do it.
The bill drew 7 amendments, among them attempts to strengthen exemptions for the agriculture industry and small businesses, and all those amendments drew this remark from Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle.
This begins my 17th year in this body, and I don't know that I've ever seen as big of a piece of legislation as this trying to be perfected on the floor as poorly as this one is.
After lunch, 5 amendments were withdrawn, leaving 2 on the table as the Senate debated the bill's impact on industry and tourism, as well as the federal government's role in immigration enforcement.
I mean, the situation is dire enough that we should convene an emergency session with our members of Congress and say, let's roll up our sleeves and get down to work. We've got a president in the White House who says he's going to work for immigration reform. You've got a House controlled by a Republican majority. You've got a Senate with a very close, got Democratic control, but very strong Republican presence. We have the ingredients, but you know what's lacking? It's political will. It's political courage. And more than a few of you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Now, bill sponsor Senator Jack Murphy characterizes his legislation as an economic development bill. He says too many of the state's resources are being used to provide for illegal immigrants.
When opponents come up to me and they say, talk to me about what this is going to do to our economy, what it's going to do to the employment, what it's going to do to this, what it's going to do to that. None of them they never come to me and say how much it is going to cost Georgia. How much is it costing the Georgia taxpayers? And whether you want to admit it or not, whether you want to admit to $1.6 billion or $1 billion or $500 million, you have to admit that it's costing Georgia taxpayers money for illegal immigration. I mean, just alone in the incarceration, it's costing $198 million estimated in incarceration. Somebody mentioned that about our prisons.
SB 40 cleared the Senate by a vote of 34 to 21. Senate Democrats will ask the Senate to reconsider its actions on Wednesday. Now, on Friday, as we mentioned in our headlines, the House approved a budget for fiscal year 2012. Continued low revenues mean that many state agencies are operating at 2001 spending levels. House Minority Leader Stacey Abrams said that the state is missing the mark when it comes to spending priorities, and she encouraged the House to vote down HB 78.
The minority stands before you in opposition to this bill and in opposition to this budget because we believe the priorities of the state must change, they must evolve, and they must reflect that we will protect not only those who can send lobbyists to this Capitol, but for those who are the least of us who need our support. And this is not simply a moral issue, it is an economic issue. The return on investment for education is tremendous. The return on investment for small businesses is incredible. We as a state must make our priorities the priorities of the citizens of the state, not some, but all. Therefore, we respectfully dissent from the majority report and urge opposition to HB 78.
The one comment I would bring to you after looking at the minority report and listening to the arguments there is that actually the only reason to vote no for this budget is for higher spending. So a no vote to me reflects that you want to spend more money, raise taxes, and take more money out of the pockets of Georgians, including the poor and the least among us that was just mentioned by the minority leader. And that would be what I would tell you today, that if you vote no, you're doing just exactly what I just said. You'll be taking more money out of those folks' pockets.
So the House adopted HB 78 on Friday. Today it approved a plan to replace the state's continuation budget system with a zero-based budgeting, which requires agencies to justify all spending on a regular basis instead of allowing some line items to roll over each year. The Senate passed a similar measure 2 weeks ago, but the House version would reunite the House-Senate Budget Office, a provision that the bill sponsor says will save the state $1 million per year.
For the past 2 years, while I've been in this body, we have been in a financial strain in the state. We have asked every department and agency to look for any duplicative service, look for any way that they can trim and cut their budgets. Ladies and gentlemen, we are presenting this bill asking that we go back to a joint legislative budget office.
If it becomes law, HB 33 would sunset in 2019, allowing the General Assembly to decide whether to continue the system. That measure passed by a vote of 161-2 and moves to the Senate. And the Senate debated today whether Medicaid fraud could be reduced if recipients were required to carry an ID card with links to patient photos, fingerprints, or other biometric information. Senator John Albers sponsors SB 63.
There are many types of fraud. There are those fraud that comes from the provider, those who seek to set up phony providers, and those who are overbilling. And then there are those on the recipient end, those who are trying to scam the system. But again, we are all clear that we want to be assured that those who need it the most will have access to Medicaid.
Is it not true that most of the Medicaid fraud committed in the United States today is by organized crime, and that what you're asking and the personal verification would not actually get at that crime? And I'll be happy to give an example if you would like to me to explain how this can easily be circumvented.
Well, I would agree it's not true, and I would agree it's not true because one of the things we do today, in a game of hockey, you can play two ways, as the great Wayne Gretzky said. Says you can skate to the puck, or you can skate to where you think the puck is going. We have to stay ahead of the puck in this case, and having digital forensics at all times that is measuring people in and out of the doctor's office and what services they have in real time will allow us to capture that literally as it's happening, not as an audit later on.
After about 90 minutes of debate, the Senate did pass SB 63 by a vote of 34-21. It now moves to the House. And in other news, the House today approved changes made by the Senate on Friday when it changed the Ethics in Government Act. HB 232 limits the number of people who must register as lobbyists, allowing private citizens to work on legislation without registering as lobbyists if they spend less than $1,000. It also allows companies to pay members of their staffs to work with the General Assembly without having to comply with lobbyist regulations if this duty makes up less than 10% of their workload. Senator Bill Hamrick presented that bill on Friday.
This is specifically in response to an advisory opinion issued by the Ethics Commission within the last 3 weeks that says that our language is so broad that it would include any person basically who's being paid, who visits the Capitol and supports or opposes legislation, to register as a lobbyist for that visit. Even if they only come down here one time in 3 years, they have to pay the fee and file all the disclosures, even though they may not spend any money.
On Friday, the Senate passed HB 232 by a vote of 39 to 13. Today, the House agreed to Senate changes made to that bill, and they sent the measure to the governor's office. In other news, Mothers Against Drunk Driving was at the Capitol today, encouraging the legislature to vote on HB 41.
Came around the corner. He lost control of his car, slid up into my mother and my grandmother's car, and hit my mother and grandmother head on. My mother blacked out for a split second, came to, and said, Mom, are you okay? At that point, my grandmother gurgled, put her head down, and she was gone. My mother watched her mother die in that car. What we did not know at the time was 14 months prior to this crash, he had had a DUI. He was on probation and had no license. On that DUI, his blood alcohol level was 0.232.
More than 2 times higher than the DUI blood alcohol threshold of 0.08. MAD encourages passage of HB 41, requiring DUI offenders to take a breathalyzer test using an ignition interlock device every time they get behind the wheel, beginning with the first conviction.
We know that the average first-time offender has driven drunk before. One particular study showed drunk drivers getting onto the road an average of 87 times before their first arrest. We know it's not enough to simply revoke the license of a convicted drunk driver. Studies show that 50 to 75% of convicted drunk drivers continue to drive while their license is suspended. This is the reason that interlocks are so critical to protecting the public.
HB 41 is currently in the House Rules Committee. And finally today, mayors from Fulton and DeKalb counties came to the Capitol today in support of next year's transportation special local option sales tax if the measure doesn't put too much financial responsibility on the citizens of the 2 counties that support MARTA.
We mayors of these cities in Fulton and DeKalb have passed resolutions saying that we support the additional 1 cent provided the General Assembly passes before the end of this session a bill that will set up a metropolitan-wide transit authority with regional funding. It is not enough to set up an authority for regional transit if this authority doesn't also receive regional support from the new 1 cent sales tax.
And even though Wednesday is the last day for legislation to clear at least one chamber, these mayors say that there is time to have legislation to support their needs. Reporting live from the Capitol, I'm Nwandi Lawson for Primetime Lawmakers.
Thanks, Nwandi. The SPLOST vote's already getting talk, and some special elections in Georgia tomorrow. There's a contentious SPLOST vote in Cobb County, special election in Gwinnett. Folks need to get out and vote. Great to see you. Hey, you too. It's time now to check in with Tom Crawford of the Georgia Report. I spoke with Tom earlier this afternoon, and we talked to him first about the swift passage of the FY 2012 budget.
Scott, the House passed the big budget last Friday, passed it very easily with a minimum of discussion and debate. Sent it over to the Senate, where I suspect it will pass just as easily. I think we've mentioned this before, that when you don't have a lot of money to spend, or in this case any, there tends to be a lot less arguing over how you're going to spend it. So it's moving through probably in as smooth a fashion as I've ever seen it move through, and it would be a real surprise if there's any major disagreement over it.
Well, that's curious. $18.1 billion. Now, other than the fact they don't have as much to play with and as much outside lobbying pressure maybe to play with, why are things moving so well? Because there's a lot of things that went on behind the scenes, committee level? What do you think?
I'm not sure it's that. It's just the recognition that you know, let's not waste a lot of time on this session, because again, the money just isn't there. And nobody wants to be up front as making big cuts in this or that or whatever, because that's not what the people back home want to hear. So I think there's a tendency just to go ahead and get it through and get it out of the way.
Meanwhile, the governor's getting ready, Tom, to sign a major piece of legislation, fixing the Hope Scholarship, Enduring Hope.
That's right. The Senate gave final passage to it last week. The House agreed to some changes that the Senate had made. The Democratic legislators are still concerned that the revised bill is going to cut out too many students, not keep hope alive, if you will, for a large enough number of students. But the governor is going to sign it, and like it or not, we've got a new hope program, or a different hope program, and hopefully it will stay in better financial shape.
So any internal pressure right now in the legislature is almost a moot point. It's
yes,
a done deal.
It's a done deal, absolutely.
Immigration reform is moving forward.
It is. The Senate voted just today, in fact, to pass their version of an immigration control bill, similar to what the House did a couple of weeks ago, maybe a little less harsh in some of its measures, but like the House bill, it motivated, inspired by the law enacted in Arizona last year. Again, Democratic members of the Senate today expressed concern about the impact that it's going to have on Georgia's business community, especially agriculture, which depends very heavily on migrant labor, as we all know. But the Senate went ahead and passed it pretty much on a party line vote, and now it's up to the House and the Senate really to negotiate what they want the final version of that bill to look like.
You predicted that the Sunday package alcohol sales issue would not die quickly. Does it show some signs of life here, bearing down on crossover day?
Well, it looks like something's going to pop out right at the very end, like a cork from a champagne bottle, if you will. The Sunday sales bill, it looks like, will come up in the Senate Rules Committee tomorrow on Tuesday. That's the committee that basically determines what the Senate will be voting on their calendar. If enough committee members decide to put it on the calendar for the Senate, they could vote on it Wednesday, send it to the House, and the issue once again is very much alive.
Derailing the Oxendine, so-called Oxendine options on a smooth ride right now, not allowing state officers to exempt themselves from licensing standards?
It is. The Senate passed their version of the bill yesterday. The House has already passed its version, and it would prevent in the future situations like the one where Insurance Commissioner John Oxendine granted himself licenses without him having even taken the test or qualifying for insurance licenses. There's a lot of outrage about that, and they want to make sure that that does not happen again.
You see tax reform moving forward?
Still moving very slowly. That's a hard one to get a handle on because last week we had a situation where A.D. Frazier, who had been the head of the Tax Reform Commission, expressed his opinion through a friend of his who's a newspaper columnist that he's not really happy with the way that the legislature is handling the recommendations that came out of that tax reform panel. That's probably a moot point because the legislators are going to do what they're going to do, but there's not a unanimity on how to move on that tax reform issue, and I'm not sure anything significant will come out this session.
And finally, crossover day coming up, Tom. Do you see a big pile of work between now and then?
There always is, Scott. That's the day when we're all here till midnight, and there's so many bills whizzing by that a lot of times you're not even sure what they're voting on, and I think a lot of times they're not sure what they're voting on.
It'll be fun to watch it with you. Tom Crawford, is always great to check in with you.
Great, thank you.
After the short break, I'll be joined by the chairman of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, Representative Terry England and Senator Jack Hill. We'll be talking about your money, the FY 2012 budget, so stay with us.
Put this earpiece in my one good ear. So.
Okay. I think I hear Representative England, Senator Hill.
Yes.
Hey, Scott.
Hey, good evening. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Glad to be here.
I won't ask you anything you don't know. Welcome back to Primetime Lawmakers. On Friday, the House passed the FY 2012 budget. That's the spending bill that appropriates funds for the fiscal year beginning July 1st. The budget projects that the state will have $18.1 billion to spend, which sounds like a lot until you consider that's about the same amount as 2001. And Georgia's population has increased 18% since then. With federal stimulus dollars not available to fill in holes this year, budget makers have had to make some tough cuts. Funding for the University of Georgia will be cut by about $75 million. K-12 education funding will decrease because of federal funds no longer available. And teachers and other state employees will see their insurance premiums rise by 20%. I'm joined now live from the Capitol by the chairman of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. Have done an awful lot of work on this, Representative Terry England of Auburn and Senator Jack Hill of Reidsville. Gentlemen, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy day under the Gold Dome to join us this evening.
Thank you, Scott.
Great to be with you here. Let's start with a little old business. The FY 2012 budget achieved final passage without having to go to a conference committee. Senator Hill, what circumstances made that possible?
Well, you know, the amended budget, FY11 amended budget, really was mostly cuts. There were probably less than 10 ads of any kind in the budget. And so when we got through looking at the few ads and the cuts and determining that we could agree on those, there really didn't seem to be any necessity of going to a conference. And plus, we were pushing forward some funds into 12, and the House, who was right in the middle of working on their FY12 budget, really needed to know what the final number was in 11 so they could help expedite the production of their budget. So I thought it made good sense.
Representative England, sounds like there was some good cooperation going on back and forth to make sure it got done quickly.
Well, Scott, there was, and Senator Hill and his folks on his committee and ours, we worked together very well this year. And it just, as he said, there were so few little odds and ends that changed. Many of the changes, especially as the cuts and a couple of the ads, were as agencies came with later information, and so it was stuff that we needed to do anyway, so nothing of a bone of contention. So just made it very easy to make those changes and come with an agreement.
Looking ahead to the next year, it's already passed the House, the big budget. Representative England, we talk a lot about decreasing revenues and budget cuts. Are there places where spending has increased?
Well, you've got a few areas where spending has increased, and some of the social service areas that, as the population has continued to grow, as you mentioned in your opening comments there, that the population has grown 18% in the last decade. So you do have areas there that you need to increase. Of course, our insurance premiums have increased as far as state employees go, and the cost of coverage of state employees has increased. So yes, there were quite a few areas that there are some increases in spending in that budget.
Senator Hill, under the proposed funding of the 2012 budget, is the state still able to provide essential services? Are you happy with what you've been hearing about that?
I believe that through the last 3 years, when we really reduced the size of state government some 25%, I don't know of any essential state services that aren't being provided to the people of the state. And public safety is being provided, and the core basic services are there. So, I think that obviously there are many things that we would love to be doing that would certainly make this a better state. But as far as issues or as far as services that are critical to people's getting along and surviving in this state, I don't think we've got anything that fits that category.
Do you think citizens will see the demonstrable differences in how they deal with the state under this new budget?
I don't think so. Terry may disagree, but I don't think so. I think that departments have downsized and identified their core missions and have eliminated services that may or may not have been essential, but they certainly could be eliminated without affecting their core services. And I don't think that anyone will be able to notice.
How about Representative England? Do you think that folks will see longer lines or more difficulty getting folks on the phone?
No, as a matter of fact, we made sure we didn't cut, especially on driver services, where an agency that has been known for long lines in the past, made sure we didn't hurt them in any way that would increase those lines. We also added a little bit of help to the Department of Revenue in the 11 budget, and we'll be doing so in the 12 budget to make sure that they've got enough people there at the call center to answer those calls on tax questions. Those type of things we've tried to be very mindful of, and the agencies have been very mindful of, making sure that we continue to provide the services that have direct impact to the public out here that we're trying to serve.
We've certainly tried to ensure that businesses who need to get in touch with the state to carry on business or renew licenses or to carry on any type of business that's important to them, that we've made the access to state government easier, and we've tried to put the resources there to ensure that happens.
You folks had an awful lot of challenges here. One of the biggest was federal stimulus money not available for this budget. Representative England, how difficult was it to find ways to plug that hole?
Well, as you can imagine, when you have $1.7 billion of your budget disappear basically overnight or at the end of the fiscal year, it does become quite the challenge. And one of the results of that is our budget will actually be $900 million smaller this year than it was in the amended 11 budget. So, there's part of that money going away there. Some of the other money came from agency across the board cuts in other agencies and just accumulating some of those savings that way. So the agencies will be impacted, but again, as Senator Hill has said, and I have also, we've tried to make sure that we're not doing anything that keeps those agencies that the public or businesses deal with from being able to do business with the state.
Along with plugging that hole, Senator Hill, you had to make some tough decisions about education and higher education. How about talking a little bit about that process?
Well, I mean, it's certainly the cuts to higher education in a state that prides itself in its higher education system are painful. But we've tried to give the Board of Regents maximum flexibility. And, certainly, even though tuition is certainly a touchy subject, frankly, they do have that option. K-12 schools, to a lesser degree, has an option, and that's local property taxes, and that's something that we certainly don't want to impact any more than we absolutely have to. So if you had to choose one area above all, you would probably choose higher education because there are other options available. But those are tough decisions, and I surely want to see the day when we can fund those institutions at a better level.
Senator, you and I have talked before about the necessity for using perhaps fees collected for other reasons, 911 call centers, disposing tires, that sort of thing, having to be included in the general fund. Do you foresee in the coming year those fees may be able to go to where they were designated, or will you have to kind of hold those in reserve?
I think there's a little bit of increase in the amount of the fees in a couple of areas that in this year's budget. I haven't studied them, but I believe I understand that there's an increase in the amount that's going to hazardous waste and to the solid waste trust fund. But yeah, I think a goal for us over the years is to get back to the point where those funds are mainly being used for that, or at least to consider that when they're being considered for renewal, as to whether they're really going for that purpose. But this is an unprecedented era we've been in the last 3 years. No one's ever seen in our state government a reduction that fast. And the fact that we're standing here today having not raised taxes and kept essential services going, I think is a tribute to the leadership of the state.
Representative England, the Georgia's unemployment fund, as far as paying back the federal government is concerned, Georgia's actually in pretty good shape compared to a lot of other states. Will there be any trouble paying back the feds along the way, or is that pretty well reined in now?
Well, we're looking at about $600 million hole right there now, as unemployment benefits, of course, have been extended almost 2 years. Employers are the ones that pay into that fund initially, and then the state doles that money back out to unemployed individuals. So ultimately, unfortunately, the liability lies with the employers, but as a state, that extension of the unemployment for an extra year and a half was certainly nothing of the employer's fault. We'll be putting money aside in the 12 budget to service the interest there on that, potentially on that loan, but also looking and understanding the federal government right now is also looking at a couple of different bills that would relieve some of that note that's hanging out there over our heads. And yes, we are in considerably better shape than a lot of other states are as that's concerned.
As far as state employees are concerned, some 97,000 workers, not even counting teachers, and they're going to have to start ponying up a little more money for their health insurance. How difficult a decision was that to make?
Well, of course, it's never easy to while you're cutting folks, to turn around and tell them they've got to pay extra. As we were sewing up the 2012 budget, then our state health benefit plan came to us and told us they projected a $250 million shortfall in next year's premiums and payouts. So with that, if we just put all of that back on the employees, it wound up being about a 67% increase if that was left untouched. We decided that we needed to do something to address that. We've done some accounting moves that allow us to draw down some extra federal dollars to match federal employees or partial federal employees that we as a state also employ. So we've drawn down a large amount that way to help fill that hole, but still wind up with about a 20% increase.
And finally, Senator Hill, the ball will be in the Senate's court now. How do you see this budget? Do your colleagues like it?
I don't know that "like" is the operative word, but we certainly appreciate the work of the House, and our committees are actually just now beginning to work on it. So we're going to go through the same process that they did, and sometimes, as Chairman England mentioned earlier, sometimes you get later data, and sometimes there's a better view of something, and we're going to be looking for that. We're going to be looking at some plans to maybe try to force some additional efficiencies and maybe combining some backroom services and those kinds of things. So we're going to be really active, and of course we've been pretty tied up leading up to crossover day, and really ain't had a whole lot of time to put to it. But starting tomorrow, our subcommittees start meeting, and they'll be meeting the rest of the week.
We'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your hard work on this. We'll be checking back with you. Great to have you on this evening. Now, lawmakers will not be seen tomorrow because the General Assembly isn't in session. We'll be back here Wednesday night at 16th at 7 for Legislative Day 30. Have a good night.
This is a GPB original production.